All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you for joining this event, the launch event for the 41.1 issue for Who Runs the World, a look at gender in international affairs. I will do a self-introduction. So my name is Ava Shin. I am the editor-in-chief of the SAIS review of international affairs. And I serve with Cody Rutherford, Harrison Cahoon, Jennifer Lee, and Jennifer Roberts. And this issue will focus, addresses a couple of issues with gender in international affairs. It focuses on issues surrounding women's increasing role in domestic and international policymaking. It explores the characteristics of female leadership and various obstacles against diversifying leadership in US government ranks. It examines the idea of feminist foreign policy and the connections between the degree of women's rights protection and pandemic readiness of state institutions. It also addresses the development challenges that women and young girls face in different countries. And I would like to say that this issue would not have been possible without the generous contributions from fellow panelists who all wrote in this issue. And it will not also be possible without the support and work of the previous editorial board led by Edie Wilson, Aaron Thomas, Will Marshall, Jacob LaRochelle, and Esther Fung. And now I would like to welcome the keynote speaker for this event. I would like to introduce you to Professor Liesl Hens, who is an assistant professor of international relations and European studies at SAIS. Her research focuses on national, ethnic, religious, and gender identities. She's also a Turkey specialist. So Professor Hens, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ava. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you to the organizers for this panel for inviting me to give this keynote speech. This is an incredible honor for me. I want to say congrats on the issue. Congratulations on putting together this spectacular group of scholars, writers, activists, analysts, organizational leaders, humans. I look at this group and I think about the responses that I sometimes still hear when people question an all-male panel or journal editorial board or a board of directors, and the excuse that I couldn't find anybody should never have held water. And it certainly doesn't now. And this is testament to that. And we have organizations and social media platforms like Women Also Know and People of Color Also Know to thank in great part for that. And even in addition to this incredibly esteemed panel today and the great discussion that's going to follow, the issue that we're celebrating today included even more contributions, including an interview with one of my favorite Turkish authors, Ece Temel Kuran. And I want to take a little bit of my time with you today to talk about her work, the role of women in novels and other forms of popular culture, and the role of popular culture in politics. My current book project examines struggles over different forms of identity. Gender, yes, but also, as Ava mentioned, ethnic, religious, national, neo-imperial, different forms of identities, and looks at those struggles over those identities in Turkey's pop culture arena. So the subject is near and dear to my heart and to the many gray hairs on my head. Like other Turkish women writers such as Elif Shafak, whose work you may be familiar with, Ece centers women in her writing. She centers themes also of freedom, liberation, change, and hope. And so I actually have a couple of her books near me to show that I actually do use them in the courses that I teach. And I wanted to mention briefly one story, one sort of metaphor that she uses in a book called The Time of Mute Swans. So in The Time of Mute Swans, this takes place in the run-up to the 1980 military coup in Turkey, which was in itself technically a bloodless coup, but led to a regime that was incredibly brutal, draconian constitution, tortures and disappearances, and other sort of outcomes that we associate with military takeovers in politics. And in the run-up to this 1980 coup, you have a situation where the leader of the coup, then general, later President Kenan Evren, was preparing for the presidential palace and was trying to move swans from Swan Park in Ankara, which I spent quite a lot of time in when I was in Ankara, wanted to move them from Swan Park into a park in front of his new presidential palace. And so he did, but then all the swans tried to fly back. And in doing so, they kept like flying into buildings and crashing into the ground. And so the Kenan Evren ordered that all of the swans needed to be made flightless. And so in order to do so, a veterinarian comes up with a plan to remove a bone from the wings of the swans. In the novel, a young girl named Aisha and her co-conspirator Ali find out about this plan and decide that they need to save the swans. So they're going to rescue the swans from the veterinarians so that they do not have this process happen to them. I won't tell you what happens in the rest of the book, but I will say that Aisha is one of the most formidable young female characters that I've met, incredibly resourceful, and that the novel carries with it a message of hope. The idea is that if you actually ask a lot of Turkish people, they don't know that swans can fly. And so the idea is that there's a metaphor that the military regime was kind of taking away the possibility of hope. It was taking away the ability for individuals to fly. And so Ece Temelkuran centers this story in a context of the Gezi Park protests in 2013, many of which took place in Swan Park. And I was a participant observer of those protests in Swan Park. So if we forget that hope is possible, if we forget that flight is possible, then we can be contained in the rules that are put upon us. But the novel comes with a message of hope and liberation that I think is incredibly important. And again, that female protagonist is a formidable one, and I encourage you to read the novel. In the interview that Ece Temelkuran did for the Review of International Affairs, she makes this statement that she says that she thinks that people think that literature is a free zone where you can sort of talk about politics, but you don't necessarily have to pay the consequences for it. She says, and I quote, "I think literature wraps politics in a sacred blanket, so to speak, that protects writers from harm," end quote. And I think this is a really interesting way of getting messages out without necessarily being overtly political about them. But I would say yes and no. Elif Shafak, who I mentioned before, was actually charged and then acquitted of the crime of insulting Turkishness for her novel about women of different generations whose lives all intersect with the Armenian genocide. This is a novel that I teach in my course along with Time of Mute Swans in the course on conflicts and cultures in contemporary Turkey here at SAIS. Ece was not indicted for her novels, but she was fired from her position as a journalist, and she considers herself in exile in Croatia. So she is living outside of Turkey at this point. I want to note that it takes extraordinary courage for women, especially for women, to write anything critical or overtly political in Turkey, whose governance regime we comparativists in political science term competitive authoritarian. By that, I mean a regime in which elections take place, but that the ruling party structures the elections on its own terms, where journalists are jailed. Turkey, for several years, was the leading jailer of journalists in the world, where the government has overwhelming influence over the media. And it's also important to note that gender equality suffers greatly in such regimes, particularly in those ruled by what I, in my own writing, like to call sort of a hyper-masculine nationalist populist strongmen club. And Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is certainly a member of that club. Just to give you a couple of sobering statistics in terms of the state of gender equality in Turkey. Government-friendly, that is friendly to the ruling AKP, the Justice and Development Party, government-friendly NGOs promote conservative roles for women, while more progressive civil society groups, and particularly LGBTQ groups, face harassment, intimidation, and imprisonment. President Erdogan has gone on record stating that he believes gender equality is not a part of nature, that it is against human nature. The former Ministry of the Women and Family Affairs was replaced by the Ministry of Family and Social Policies, effectively erasing women as individuals outside of their role as mothers. Turkey very recently, on July 1st of this year, withdrew from the Istanbul Convention on the Rights of Women. Turkey ranked in 2020 133rd among 156 countries in terms of gender equality, and that's gone down significantly in the last 10 years. 40% of women report experiencing some form of domestic violence, either sexual or physical violence, and that's report, I note. And rates of femicide have increased drastically last year, and this is only according to government statistics. Other organizations would give you much higher numbers, but according to government statistics, 266 women were murdered by a partner or a male individual that they knew. And I think it's really important to recognize, as I do in the courses that I teach, that discourse is a part of the way in which individuals are treated, that the speech that individuals in positions of power, in positions of authority make shapes the way in which individuals in society perceive particular behaviors as acceptable or appropriate, or, you know, things that they can get away with. I will note that a very prominent figure, religious figure on a television show and a very prominent Ramadan program, noted that he believed that pregnant women were unaesthetic and that they shouldn't be out in public, and that if they need to get air, they should have their husbands drive them around. I will note that a former prominent member of the ruling party noted that women shouldn't laugh out loud and that their modesty should be respected at all times. I want to give these statistics and then just very briefly, as I sum up, talk about why I think cultural portrayals are important. So a recent film centered on Turkish women actually plays the quote of this AKP figure saying that women shouldn't laugh out loud. And then, and I won't spoil the plot and I won't name the movie, has an incredibly dramatic scene that follows it. So it's kind of mirroring the effect, or demonstrating the effect of what these words can actually have on women in the real world. I want to encourage us to look for women's voices in cultural forms, in pop culture, in novels, in music, in all forms of cultural expression. Perhaps, as Ece Cemal-Karan suggested, there is some safety in expressing ourselves through culture and in asserting that women, that people of all genders belong in the public sphere. I want to draw attention to a project called Susamam, or I Can't Stay Silent. I've written a journal article on this. I've written an op-ed on this. This was a music piece put together by a number of artists protesting against some of the grievances that they noticed in Turkish society. And far and away, the most powerful piece of this is the only woman in the video basically articulating the experience of domestic violence, bringing to life some of the sounds recorded from actual killings of women that were recorded on cell phones, bringing that into the public sphere and drawing people's attention to it and making them pay attention to it. There's many examples of this in which we can bring women's stories, people of all genders' stories to light, to the public sphere through media, through culture. Read these, watch these, stream them, study them, take them seriously as politics, take them seriously as subjects to study, as subjects to teach. I have to confess that I came to gender relatively late, even as someone who wanted to study the politics of identity. I remember that a woman classmate once remarked to me that, oh, there's only 3 of us in this classroom and there's 15 men. And I didn't really notice that. And I think that's because I'd experienced many privileges in my life, white privilege and socioeconomic privilege along with that. But then in grad school, I had a Me Too moment. I learned from syllabi with almost all men as the authors. I heard a woman candidate for a position called Fragile, and when giving comments to a US ambassador, had another man make those same comments and attribute them to himself and not to me. So all that to say is that my experiences, and even more so, efforts by platforms like these and the dedicated individuals who organize and support them have changed the way I think, the way I reflect on being someone who researches and teaches, not only on the politics of identity, but also politics and international affairs more broadly. And that's why I applaud wholeheartedly the launch of this issue and the discussion around it. And I'm privileged to be a part of it. So thank you so much and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Professor Hintz, for that powerful speech. You delivered messages of hope, courage, and you recounted a lot of the challenges that women face under the political context of Turkey. And thank you so much for that keynote speech. And with that, I am going to happily introduce the panelists that we have for today. So Professor Sarah Angevin is an assistant professor at Whittier College, and Professor J. Jarpa Dawuni is an assistant professor from Howard University, where she is also the director of Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership. Professor Gabamend Johnson is an assistant professor of government from Hamilton College. Professor Carmen Geha is an assistant professor at the American University of Beirut, and she is also the co-founder of the Center of Inclusive Business and Leadership for Women at the American University of Beirut. And Professor Charlotte Karam is an assistant professor at the Telfer School of Management at University of Ottawa. Working with Professor Geha, Professor Karam is also the founding director for the Center of Inclusive Business and Leadership for Women. Dr. Jeni Klugman is the managing director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Ms. Constance Pruitt is a PhD candidate and instructor in political science at Howard University. And last but not least, Ms. Miriam Temin is a project director and associate at the Population Council. She is an expert on adolescent girls and on sexual and reproductive health. And with that, our questions are actually going to be starting with Ms. Temin. So Ms. Temin, in your co-authored article, Smarter Investments in Girls Today to Prepare Them to Thrive Tomorrow, you remarked that adolescent girls face opportunities and challenges that are neither static nor simple under the COVID-19 pandemic. So based on your research and work at the Population Council, could you provide some examples of education and health challenges faced by young girls in different countries? Has the pandemic exacerbated existing challenges, or has it created new ones? And what about opportunities?
Great. Well, thanks, Ava, and panelists and event organizers for including me, and thanks for your question, which provides me with an opportunity to amplify the major point of the journal article that we wrote about the importance of using evidence so that policies, programs, and investments for adolescent girls are based on evidence, not on intuition. And this need is especially urgent now as COVID-19 undermines national economies and development funds are being diverted to deal with the pandemic. So against this backdrop, evidence now is increasing on the concerningly gendered effects of COVID-19. Many of the risks that disproportionately threaten adolescent girls are not new, but are exacerbated by the pandemic as it intersects with pre-existing structural inequality and inequitable power relations and gender norms. I'll briefly mention just a few. Globally, girls' access to schooling was improving, but now that may have stalled. For example, in Kenya, my colleagues worked with the government to study the number of students who did not return to school when they reopened in January, finding that 8% of boys and 16% of girls did not return. We see similar evidence emerging from Mexico, particularly in indigenous communities. To note, school dropout can exacerbate food insecurity, where school feeding was an important source of nutrition for children. Global Girls on Child Marriage were also moving in the right direction pre-pandemic. And while it's too early to assess COVID's full effect on the age of marriage, there is evidence in some settings of child marriage increasing in the face of school closures, as well as lack of government officials to enforce child marriage laws. In Bangladesh, for example, where child marriage had been going down, my colleagues found evidence in rural areas of an increase in marriage-related discussions, particularly in households experiencing economic shocks. Two other major under-addressed challenges that are deepening under COVID are mental health problems and gender-based violence. A longitudinal study in Australia, for example, found a significant increase in depression and anxiety, and again, that was more pronounced for girls than for boys. Social isolation that accompanied lockdowns may have exacerbated these conditions. Isolation and social distancing is also associated with the uptick in reported incidents of gender-based violence. You asked in your question about opportunities and recommendations. Combating social isolation, which is often the most acute for the girls who face the highest risks, like marriage girls, is vital. Evidence suggests that girls who have access to organized clubs or peer groups in their communities, often in the context of SAIS-based programs, may fare better in crises. Under COVID, trained mentors in these communities have checked in on girls and arranged socially distanced meetings to provide essential social contact. The trained mentors have also served as public figures, distributing personal protective equipment and health information to community members. In addition to combating social isolation, prioritizing girls' learning continuity is essential. Another recommendation for adolescent girls is to shine a bright light on the intra-household dynamics within households. Emergency supplies typically are distributed to households, personal protective equipment, cash transfers, and food. But what do we know about who has access to those resources within the household once it gets inside? Monitoring the distribution of emergency resources by age and by sex within households is a vital part of a gender transformative emergency response. So if women are to run the world, intentional efforts are needed to explicitly include adolescent girls in action to mitigate the pandemic's gendered effects. This is a priority now to avoid stalling and backsliding on progress, and it's a priority for the future to prepare tomorrow's women to respond to the inevitable next crisis. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ms. Tamim. I applaud your work at the Population Council, and I really hope that these awesome recommendations can get to policymakers and we can get to make those difference in the world quickly. Okay, so moving on to Dr. Klugman. So let's talk about your interesting article. So your article's methodology combines the Women, Peace, and Security Index, a signature of the Georgia Institute that you lead, and the Inform Epidemic Risk Index. And your article finds that there is a correlation that in countries where women enjoy a higher level of well-being, the government is generally better equipped to handle pandemics. So under this context of this correlation, I would like to ask the US as a case study. So during the 2019 to 2020 US WPS index, it was ranked at the 19th place, relatively high. And its Inform Epidemic Risk Index is 3 out of 10 with a low risk of outbreaks and pandemic and a high degree of pandemic readiness. However, given the US pandemic response, could one say that the US case does not fit into this correlation?
Thanks very much, Ava, and let me join the others in thanking you for putting this together, but also my regrets that I didn't finally get to meet some of my students from the graduate class on gender and development I taught at SAIS last term. But just very quickly, because I know that we have many great people to come. The Global Women, Peace and Security Index measures achievements in inclusion, for example, social, economic, and political aspects of inclusion, justice, both legal discrimination as well as norms that our keynote, I think, very powerfully drew our attention to, as well as security. So security in the home, the risk of violence in the home, in the community, and at large. And we rank some 170 countries along these lines. And it turns out, not only with respect to pandemic preparedness, but also other global indices. So for example, the Human Development Index, the Freedom House Index, environmental performance indices, the good things often tend to go together. So we see this broad correlation that can be depicted in a scatter plot. I believe that statisticians regard a correlation over about 0.7 as being strong. So for all of these indices that I mentioned, including the Inform Index, it's around 0.8, 0.85, and so on. So there's a strong correlation. But of course, correlation is not causation, as all the good graduate students here of course know, but it's an observed pattern across countries. When we look at the US, and just as a kind of heads up, we're just about to publish the next edition, the third edition of the Women, Peace and Security Index, and the US is dropping in terms of its ranking. So it's now dropped out of the top 20. But clearly the US did worse than expected, worse than it could have. In terms of the systems and the preparedness which was ostensibly in place, clearly it was not managed well, and that's a separate conversation. But I think it's also to show that the potential conditions can be in place, but it depends very much on the leadership and the will and so on. So let me stop now. I'd encourage you to look at the next edition of the index, which is being released in a couple of weeks, to think of it as a tool to help to illustrate some of the important themes that have already been alluded to and discussed, I think, very well on this panel, but then also to dive deeper to really understand what's going on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Klugman, and for promoting your the third edition of the WPS Index that will be featured on the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security website. So I encourage all of the attendees to check it out when they have a chance. They are doing some really great work there. So thank you, Dr. Klugman. So I'm going to move on to our next panelists, co-authors, Professor Skeha and Karam. In your article, you address this concept that's called state feminism in the Middle East and North Africa region. So for the attendees who haven't really read your article yet, could you briefly explain this concept of state feminism?
Thank you so much for having us and including us in this. I wouldn't normally make this correction, but because it's a panel on gender, I want to note that my co-author and mentor and friend, Charlotte Karam, is in fact an endowed chair of leadership and inclusive HR systems and not an assistant professor. I'm only saying this because us women, we tend to brush that off, and I think it's important. That being noted, we're very happy to be speaking on the Middle East and North Africa, where the state has adopted in recent years its own version of feminism and its own project on gender equality. And while that has allowed many Arab states to make some strides, the salient and prevalent version of state feminism is one that promotes a state interest and perpetuates inequalities by focusing solely on women nationals and on participation of women in certain sectors in the economy. And in the article, we critique this and we offer a more intersectional approach to how we can mobilize towards more inclusive policies, and where the state has focused on women's empowerment, placing the burden and the onus of change on women themselves, we call for a shifting in that strategy to place the burden and the onus for change, in fact, on state structures and organizational policies and practices. So I'll stop it at that. It's from our work, from the vantage point of our work at the Center for Inclusive Business and Leadership for Women at the American University of Beirut.
Well, thank you for that amazing transition, and it was my bad about mixing up the titles. As co-directors for the Center for Inclusive Business and Leadership for Women, how do you engage in grassroots initiatives to move beyond or circumvent this state feminism that you just mentioned, and as I quote in your article, models of state, models and policies that restrict structural change in terms of women's rights?
Thanks so much, Eva. And again, it's such an honor to be here with everyone. This is a great question because I think it gets to the core root of how the center started. So basically, we started as a grassroots group of individuals trying to work towards identifying core areas around empowerment of women and other marginalized groups. And what we did was we brought together unconverted, half converted, and fully converted towards a feminist agenda. So we had like 17-year-old activists with heads of unions, with CEOs of companies, and we sat and we started to think around how can we begin to move forward the agenda around women's empowerment, economic empowerment in particular. And one thing that really stood out to us from the very beginning was the idea that there were very few structures, whether at the organizational level or state level, around gender-based violence within the workplace. And so this started way back in 2015, and we started to really unpack what this means. How can we begin to introduce protections in a failing state? And what the instability of the state, I'm talking about in Lebanon in particular, although now we're working across the region, but in particular, it's very difficult to adopt a state feminist model when the state itself is very unstable, inconsistent in its presence. Over a 4-year period of time, we had 4 different governments. There was a Ministry of Women, then it went away, and then, right? So this is the core question that we try to answer and try to focus on. And so we started an experiment with this center, which is the idea that how can we begin to engage a local business? I'm not talking about transnational, multinational corporations. I'm talking about local SMEs, medium-sized and large-sized businesses that are from the region, for the region. How can we begin to partner with these local businesses to try to augment, further mobilize multiple actors towards structural change? And so this is the work that the center is built on, and we are very happy and blessed for the types of groups that we've been able to work with to change policy, both at the HR level, but also at the state level in terms of some of the legislative change that we've done. I'll stop there. I could go more, but I'll stop.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for that, kind of account for the work that you do at the center. And I have a follow-up question in terms of how to envision, the state government's role in improving women's rights. Do you see a possibility of, changing this state feminism into a more inclusive framework at the government level in the MENA region, or should we continue to view state governments in the region as sort of obstacles, if you will, against women's rights, improving women's rights in the region?
We're not in favor of looking at states as obstacles in the absolute sense, on the contrary, but we are in favor of mobilizing from outside of the usual sphere. So I'll give you a very concrete example. We have a network of about 100 employers that are now drafting and implementing inclusive employment policies. That momentum pushes states to be more inclusive and shows that policy change and structural change can and should happen in a region really that's home to a lot of women who aren't only nationals. It's home to conflicts, it's home to migrant workers, it's home to refugees. And so when we begin to showcase some mobilizing, as Charlotte was saying, by involving grassroots activists, women's associations, but also the private sector, that puts a model that challenges state hegemony and challenges this idea that the region is exceptional, that it's impossible to change it. On the contrary, employers and decision makers, by partnering with us, are slowly changing that narrative. And so, no, we don't want to keep regarding the state as an obstacle, but in its current version, state feminism is an obstacle to an intersectional approach that would allow us to pick up not only the privileged few in urban centers, but really everybody in the region, all women. Because we want all women in the region to run Arab states and not only a select lucky few.
Thank you so much for that response, Professor Geha. And you really have, injected this message of hope in terms of reform for a better future. So I really appreciate that. And just a side note to our attendees, if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. You'll be able to see them at the bottom of your screen, so you can add your questions there just throughout the conversation, and we'll be having a time to respond to your questions a little bit at the end. So thank you for that. And now I'm going to move on to Professor Bemende Johnson's article. So Professor Johnson, in your article, you remarked that since the start of the modern presidency, Democratic presidents have appointed higher numbers of women and women of color to the federal bench than Republican presidents. So in the context of the current Biden administration, has this administration appointed any women to the federal judiciary system? Or has this administration initiated any programs to increase the gender and racial diversity in federal judicial appointments?
Thank you, and thank you so much for organizing this, and I'm happy to be here. So to answer the question about where the administration stands in its appointments, so the Biden administration has nominated approximately 40 judges to the federal bench. So we're thinking district courts and also circuit courts. And of those 40, 14 have been confirmed so far, which that may not sound like a lot, but comparatively, he's actually doing very well to the number of judges that other presidents have appointed at this point in time. So he's trying to move very quickly. Now, of those appointments, majority of those appointments have been women, and he has made a number, he's basically followed through on his promise to appoint many women of color. So just a few names: Regina Rodriguez, Flores Pan, Tiffany Cunningham, I'm thinking Ketanji Brown Jackson. Those are just some of the few women of color who he has successfully shepherded through the process. And of course, trying to do this as quickly as possible, because who knows what could happen in 2020 and with the Senate majority. So there you see some movement in trying to diversify the federal bench, and it kind of points to how central it is to having someone who is supportive of that. The previous administration was not, basically appointing women of color was not a priority, although the administration did appoint a higher number of women compared to other previous Republican administrations. But at the federal system, who you have in place is going to play a huge role there. And as we know, those are lifetime appointments. So those are going to, affect the demographics of the bench for quite some time. So, and he has a number of nominees still waiting who are women and women of color as well. So there you see some progress.
All right. Thank you for sharing your insights, Professor Johnson. And so my next question is, talking about how your article highlights the leaky pipeline phenomenon, where barriers are present at each step for women or women of color to ultimately become a state or federal judge. So what are some of the actions that could be implemented by governments, law schools, or professional legal organizations to remove these barriers and ensure more women can stay in the legal pipeline, if you will?
And that's such a I don't want to say it's a tricky question, but the institutional, social, structural barriers are so deeply ingrained. It takes a momentous amount of work to push against them. But there are some things that can be done and are being done by the actors that you just mentioned. So one thing is, of course, starting early within the pipeline. So thinking about, students who may even be in high school. So a lot of individuals in law school or even higher education, they may have had someone in their network who was a lawyer. And that can give someone, advantage might not be the right word, but you have this insight into this career that you may not have if you don't know anyone in your network. And one of the surveys that I cited in the paper by, let me make sure I get the name right, the National Association for Law Placement, they found that women of color women of color in particular were reporting having fewer people in the legal profession in their networks. So if you can start early, for example, legal organizations, law schools, by exposing underrepresented individuals at an early age to individuals in these professions, to let them know this is a path that could be open to you if you're interested. That's going to be really important, because someone who has no interaction with someone in a type of network might not consider that to be a career path, or might not even be aware that that's an opportunity. So attempting to provide exposure early within the pipeline is really important, of course, so that if you're going to college, you are you already have that in mind as a potential path. Now we know law school is very expensive. People are aware of the student loan burden. So of course, resources are going to be really important, particularly for those individuals from underrepresented groups as well, so that the expenses associated with attending law school are not completely prohibitive for those individuals. Now, something else that's important, and we see this in law schools and also in higher education, are some of the experiences that individuals recount during their legal education that make continuing less attractive. And this could be perhaps experiences with peers or experiences with other faculty or administration. So this can emerge basically in the terms of biases, or feeling that you are not being viewed as someone who has as much potential as perhaps, say, for example, a woman of color compared to a white male student. And surveys have bared that out as well, going back to the survey I just cited, where women of color noted that they have felt that they were perhaps taken less seriously than other students. And that, of course, is going to get to perhaps, and this is, there's been criticism of this, but bias training for those individuals within those institutions to make them aware of how they are interacting with students, to make sure that there's as much fairness and equity as possible. So that's within the within the education pipeline. And I'll speak briefly in terms of the legal career. You also have like the ABA and other law firms working on perhaps providing greater flexibility so that you don't have women being pushed out because of work responsibilities. Also, are these steps for promotion, are they clear? Or do you have to be within a certain group to know what exactly is required? Do you have perhaps random allocation of certain assignments so that women aren't necessarily volunteering for those less desirable assignments that aren't necessarily going to get them to promotion? So I feel like I could keep going, but I feel like it's probably stopped right there.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so now I'll move on to the article co-authored by Professor Dawuni and Ms. Pruitt, which highlighted the a lack of Black female ambassadors appointed by the U.S. government. And you also provided numerous advocacy recommendations to diversify ambassadorships. So first, Ms. Pruitt, what policies should be adopted, in your opinion, by higher ed institutions focused on international affairs and diplomacy, such as SAIS, and other policy schools in DC, in order to contribute to a U.S. ambassadors corps that includes more Black women and women of color?
Great, Ava, thank you so much for that question. And just thank you to SAIS and congratulations on the latest SAIS review. And thank you for all the attendees for coming here today. And so I'd be happy to answer that question. And so especially I would like to speak on the important issue of gender, specifically the intersectionality of race and gender as it applies to the work that Dr. Dawuni and myself has done in this SAIS review. And so secondly, it is an honor to be among such esteemed panelists. I've enjoyed everything that has been said thus far. And so within our article, we provide several advocacy recommendations to the international community on how to increase the pipeline for potential Black women being considered for presidential appointments to US ambassadorships. And that is because the numbers of underrepresentation are quite apparent for Black women ambassadors in the US. At the time of writing the article, and I'll be very brief, but at the time of writing the article, there were a total of 2,363 US ambassadors in American history. And out of that 2,363, only 54 had been Black women ambassadors. So that really sparked our interest in doing further research into the very few Black women ambassadors in American government. And so as far as, different types of policy implementation that we would recommend, our paper actually goes into several recommendations, as Ava said. And so some of those things included things like policy papers, recruitment initiatives, and more professional development that leads to increased promotions from the public and private sectors. However, we do also provide some recommendations that could be adopted by institutions of higher education. So specifically to answer your question, for policy schools in the DC area, for example, which is arguably they're in the hub of international affairs within the United States, it's imperative to create initiatives to bring awareness to the lack of diversity in diplomacy and the opportunities or ways in which to change that. For universities, that can come in, I would say, 3 different forms. That could be education reform, research initiatives, and programs. And so we would recommend universities and encourage them to increase their scholarly research that highlights the importance of discussing the intersection of race and gender in diplomacy. This can be done through school publications such as SAIS, postdoc research, and even reflected within course syllabi. Universities can also establish programs to build diversity pipelines for preparing students to pursue future careers in international diplomacy. These institutions can create programs and events such as roundtables, conferences, and workshops that convene diverse individuals interested in a career path of ambassadorships. And it'll allow them to share ideas and learn about the diplomatic process, and even perhaps partnering with HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities in the area, such as Howard University, Bowie State, and many others. And then lastly, a recommendation for universities would be to consider creating partnerships and programs with organizations outside of institutes of higher education. So for example, one organization, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, WCAPS, that would be great to, for university to start partnerships with them. There's another organization called BPIA, Black Professionals in International Affairs. Another would be Diversity and National Security Network. All of these organizations exist, and it would be great if we see, increased partnerships with universities with those organizations. And so to be brief and in synopsis, all of these are proposed policy initiatives that would bring awareness and enlightenment that you do not and should not have to be a certain race or gender to have a career in diplomacy or to obtain diplomatic appointments such as ambassadorships.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pruitt. I was muted earlier. All right, so moving on to Professor Dawuni. I would like to ask you about the recently launched Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership in November 2020 at Howard University, and how it envisions creating a data center on issues of women and gender in the United States and the global Black diaspora. So would you say that this data center will complement and inform efforts to diversify U.S. ambassadorship? If so, how?
Thank you, Ava, and thank you for SAIS Review for having us, and wonderful journal. I've read most of the articles I'm still working through, and it's a pleasure to be in the midst of my colleagues here. And I really want to commend my graduate student, Constance Pruitt, and to start off by saying that this is what the Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership at Howard University is going to be about. It's about centering the experiences of Black women, excellence of Black women in research, in activism and gender consciousness, and most importantly, global leadership. And so as a professor, an associate professor of political science, I think it's part of my duty as a professor and also as a director of the center to focus the center on the students' experiences within the campus and outside. And one of the ways in which we can do that is by working with graduate students like Constance Pruitt, research, producing knowledge, and getting them onto the job market, which is going to be on the job market soon. So watch out for Constance Pruitt. Having said that, the center really is going to be officially launched on October 20th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. I'm happy to share the flyer when it comes out next week, and we invite everyone to watch and join us virtually. Main things that we're going to be doing, like I said, is really focused on students. And so one of the things that we will be focusing on to see how students can conduct research with faculty, engage in serving the local community, and also having a global experience. In as much as this research I've worked on with Constance is about Black women in diplomacy, it's also about the broader issues that Black women face, whether in the United States or globally. So we're going to be addressing issues of law and social justice, politics and public policy, entrepreneurial leadership, women in science and technology, and also looking at, I'm blacking out on the fifth one, which has never happened to me, and health and wellness, I think, is the fifth one. So we're looking for partners to engage with it. And in terms of this paper that we've written, I'm excited to say that we're going to be the first research project that we're going to launch under the center is about women in diplomacy, or Black women or women of color in diplomacy. And another one that I'm just having a discussion with my colleague, Professor Bemende Johnson, is to also look at Black women in judiciaries, United States and globally. So these are two big projects that we're going to start at the center. We invite people to collaborate with us.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Dawuni. I do have a follow-up question for Professor Johnson and you and Ms. Pruitt, but first I think I'll move to Professor Sarah Angevine in the interest of time, and then at the end we can circle back to that question. So Professor Angevine, in your article, you divided the U.S. women's foreign policy into 5 eras, with the most recent one being 2011 to 2020. It's called American Feminist Foreign Policy. And do you think the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has created a new distinct era in US feminist foreign policy, or is it a continuation of the most recent era?
Thank you. And just like everybody, I also appreciate these kind of forums for the questions that I think we all think need to be answered, addressed, and given space on the research agenda. So in terms of the decade idea, I mean, you know, time does not always neatly cut trends, but when information is just a forest, you know, you kind of have to draw some boundaries. And to your question, I think that, you know, it's very, you know, early. We're still in 2021. However, with COVID-19 and climate change, we have global threats. And so my hope would be that we see a shift in American foreign policy that emphasizes global cooperation and multilateralism. And I'm optimistic because we're also seeing demographic changes in Congress. And some of my other research looks at like who is introducing bills, and you know, we have an increase of women in Congress, we have an increase of women of color in Congress, and with those trends and with these global threats, not necessarily by, you know, non-state actors, that we could see greater shifts towards not like American exceptionalism as American feminist foreign policy, but maybe there'll be something more like global feminist foreign policy that emphasizes partnerships with like the United Nations. And my personal hope is to see CEDAW ratified. That would be a very exciting part of the next decade if that were to happen.
Yes, thank you. I actually have a follow-up question to that as well, since you mentioned your research about the US Congress and who passes these bills. And so I'm trying to sort of tie domestic politics of the US to its foreign policy objectives. So given the passage of the Texas law restricting abortion access and the abortion rights bill passed by the US House of Representatives, does the domestic debate over abortion rights have an impact on how the US approach reproductive rights and women and gender equity as part of its foreign policy objectives?
I'm sure actually all the panelists here maybe have something to say on this, because it has a huge impact. And so I have another article that's called Aborting Global Women's Rights that looks at 3 bills as case studies in the 111th. And I mean, the thing about the US Congress is that domestic politics is the engine of activity, and that can be a blessing or a burden. And given that abortion is one of the most polarizing issues, it is a catalyst for motivation in both directions. And so for those interested in advocating for any type of policy proposal that addresses women, this is sometimes the threading the needle that's very, very challenging because of how little Americans care about global women's rights policy. So there's not the same electoral constraint on these issues that you see in domestic policy. We just do not see that much mobilization when foreign policies are restricting women's access to reproductive health that we would see in domestic policy. So as such, basically, it becomes a real thorny issue. However, in the 115th Congress, so 111th, all the bills die on abortion, in the 115th, we see 3 women's foreign policy bills pass into statute. And that was a big puzzle for me. How were they able to get over that abortion issue? And they were all sponsored by Republicans. So I think that there is a way in which Republicans can walk those policies through and have trust that this isn't going to touch the abortion issue. But my broader point there is just that we can do the same type of things we've done in domestic policy in the United States, which is advance women's liberal rights, like economics and to be a member of the military, things that kind of reflect very liberal roles for women. But when it comes to women's bodies and things of that nature, it's still highly contentious domestically, and it's still highly contentious as a aspect of American foreign policy.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Anjaveen. Okay, I'm going to circle back to the last question I want to ask because I think it's an awesome question. So I'm sorry we don't have time for Q&A, but I will send an email and hopefully get your response to you, Danielle. Okay, so this question is for Professors Johnson, Dawuni, and Ms. Pruitt. So your article is focused on diversifying different sections of the U.S. government, its judicial and executive branches. Given the context of the Black Lives Matter protests that took place last year, could you comment on whether or how popular protests for racial and gender equality have translated into efforts to diversify leadership, particularly in the government?
Constance, do you want to start?
Sure, and I'll be very brief. Thank you so much, Professor Johnson, and thank you, Ava, for that question. It is a really important question. I'm very glad that you actually asked it. So thinking about BLM, Black Lives Matter, as a social movement, like many social movements, they have had moments of, ebb and flow with heightened activity in 2020. But to be clear, the movement definitely still lives on because unfortunately the issue of racism that was being advocated against still persists. However, I do think there are some initiatives or results from the advocacy of BLM, particularly diversification initiatives within the diplomacy sector that we are starting to see. One main example that comes to mind instantly would be within the State Department. This past April, Secretary of State Blinken actually announced the appointment of the State Department's first, emphasis on first, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and that is Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley. And so Secretary Blinken remarked in his announcements that it was imperative to ensure that U.S. foreign policy delivers for the American people, and one way of achieving that is to have a workforce that is a true representation of the American people, which is diverse, and that our diversity needs to be seen on an international stage, and because the international stage is diverse. And so he also noted that the issue of diversity has been well known for quite some time within the State Department and within the diplomacy sector in general, and that's true. So this problem has been known for years, as we mentioned in our article, yet just now in 2021, we are seeing more concrete policy and programmatic changes. So why is that? Why now? And so I would argue that you see that happening now because of the efforts of such movements such as Black Lives Matter.
All right, thank you so much for that, Ms. Pruitt. Professor Johnson, do you have anything to add just for 1 minute or two?
Well, I think Constance really summed it up really well. Just one of the side effects is, what Black Lives Matter is making the issue very salient. And you have a large group of vocal individuals who are willing to call out companies, government organizations, and institutions if their behaviors and hiring practices are not matching up or reflective of the population. So you do see some responsiveness to that. I think with the Biden administration perhaps being even more responsive than it would have been. But of course, there's still a long way to go because there's resistance as well.
Yes, that is absolutely true. All right, so we are at 1 o'clock, and I would like to give a big shout out to all the panelists who are here today. Thank you so much for taking your time, in your busy schedule to be on this panel. And I hope for the participants, this panel has been very informative, and I hope that you all really want to read the issue that we just put out because it is awesome. And if you would like to get a print copy of the issue, please just catch me around campus because I'll probably have some in my backpack at all times. And if you also want an issue, you can also just message in WhatsApp and whatever, and we can coordinate that way. Or you can email me. So there are a lot of ways for you to get your issues, which looks like this. And we also have complimentary bookmarks and stickers that go with it. So if you want them, please come get them. All right, so I'm going to close this webinar, and thank you everyone so much for coming. And I hope you had a good time as I did. So thank you, and have a good weekend ahead, everyone. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Nice to meet you all.